Good to see everybody this morning. About time to begin our Bible class. Looking forward to continuing on in our study of Deuteronomy. I want to encourage you to remember in prayer Mark Ebert, who is awaiting tests for heart issues, and also there are many others on the prayer list as well. Peggy Farr sent me a message that, and I just forgot his name. Do you remember, Stephen? From Virginia?
She didn't send me a message.
Okay. Well, there is a longtime member that was here that is in Virginia now that is actually at UNC not Wilmington, Charlotte at the hospital and needs our prayers. I will have that name shortly, so I apologize that I forgot that. But continue to remember those that are on our prayer list as well throughout the week and as the updates go out so that we can be praying for one another. Before we get started this morning, Matt, would you lead us in a word of prayer? Amen. So picking up in our study this morning in Deuteronomy, we're finishing out the emphasis of Moses on how the Israelites are to conduct themselves in the land and the things that they are to abide by. We talked about unlawful unions and there are several elements here. Mixing kinds is one of those things that he says emphatically they should not be doing. And so the seventh commandment is you shall not commit adultery. Adultery is mixing relationships that ought not be together, at least in our common parlance. But adultery is to mix, okay, and so to bring things together. And so something that is adulterated typically is mixed with something else, and therefore it is not pure, right? So the antonym for purity is that which is adulterated. So when we think about these unlawful unions, it's not just in a relational type mentality or setting. It is also in things. So unnatural and immoral unions of all kinds were prohibited by this command, clearly. But then mixing kinds also. So two kinds of seeds were not to be planted in a vineyard. An ox and a donkey were not to be yoked together. We talked about that last week. Clothes in which two types of cloth had been woven together were also to be avoided. Why was this the case for the Israelites? What was God's emphasis to them when they came and dwelt in the land? What did He want them to be?
They're supposed to be separated and pure and wholly devoted to Him.
Yes, separate, pure, wholly devoted to Him, which meant, would they be the same as the nations around them? No. So the customs and practices of the nations that dwelt in the land previously were to be done away with, and they would be different than the nations around them while they remained in the land. And part of that was the not mixing of these things. Sexual violations as well. There are 4 categories that are addressed. Premarital promiscuity, again, we talked about that. And the problem with this is what? Yes, the immoral nature of it and that violates God's commands. Secondarily, what is another problem with this? Yes, inheritances, okay? And who gets what? So if you have children born out of wedlock, then where do they go? And do they have any part? Adultery. The punishment for adultery is that they were both executed. In John 7:53 through 8:11, we have the woman who is taken in the act of adultery and brought before Jesus, but who is conspicuously missing? The man that was engaged in that act with her, at least as they so accused her of. Okay, so again, we see a perversion of the law by Jesus' time in these very things. Rape was punishable by death, but the man was also obliged to marry that person and could never divorce her if he defiled her in this way, and that was the exception. Promiscuity between a man and a stepmother was also seen as abominable. We see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, as Paul is talking about the man who has his father's wife. This would more than likely be what he's referring to, and therefore he is cut off from the church. He is disfellowshipped. Then we get admission to the assembly. So 4 categories of people are to be excluded from the assembly. First and foremost, we talked about, and we started in on this discussion last week, but a man who had been emasculated. They had no future in the congregation of Israel through posterity. Now again, why were they to be put out from the assembly?
Because they weren't perfect.
They weren't perfect. God wanted purity in all things. So what happened to the handicapped people? What happened to the people who struggled with malformations or deformities? Where were they? Were they just cast aside and ignored and left to their own devices? Did they have obligations to be taken care of? What are your thoughts?
Well, they had to be taken care of. They also still, being a Jew, they still had the responsibility of obeying God. But how close they could come to the temple of God was the major effect. They could not come in within what was called the women's court. They had to stay out like in the Gentile court.
Yes, they could not gather together with the assembly of the congregation of the Lord's people. Now, we know of an individual who is deformed or lame on both his feet. I know, David, you know the answer. Does anybody know who I'm talking about? What's that? Yeah, Mephibosheth. Okay, in Chronicles and in Samuel, we get the discussion of Mephibosheth, okay, who is lame on both his feet. He was dropped as a child, more than likely, and a cart ran over his feet, and now he can't work. And what happens that is unique in Israel with Mephibosheth? What's that? Yes, David brings him to the king's table, and he says, "You shall eat bread always or continually at my table." So it was not common for those who were lame or deformed or any of those kinds of things to be taken care of in that way, in a very unique sense as David does. But why does David do that? Now, this is a little bit of a departure. I'm just testing your Bible knowledge. Why does David do that?
Jonathan's son, he's trying to provide for his friend Jonathan.
That's exactly right. And the text tells us for Jonathan's sake, right? Because of his relationship with Jonathan. And in a very real way, that is the relationship that we have with Christ, right? God brings us in because of whose sake? Well, for Christ's sake. God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. So again, this idea is seen because of the purity element that God expects in the nation. Now, one of the things that I mentioned was Daniel and his compatriots when they are taken into Babylonian captivity. Part of the goal of them being emasculated that way was to rob them of everything that identified them as someone that they were before. To strip them down from everything that they knew and then to build them back up in Babylon's image. And to take away their culture, their heritage, everything that they had known. And so when this is done, at least to them, it's with the goal and the intent to reform them. A person of illegitimate birth, a mamzer, it means illegitimate child, child of a cult prostitute, or a child born of an incestuous relationship. It's used in various ways, but all of them would be illegitimate births because there's no marriage involved in these things. So the result is the same. Now, why are they cut off? Okay, they came out of an imperfect union. Does that mean that they don't get to live in the land at all?
No.
They just don't have an inheritance and they can't draw near to the assembly. Okay, so again, there are consequences for people's actions. What is the purpose of the consequences of being cut off of the assembly? Anybody know? Why is disfellowship effective? Because we need each other, right? That's exactly right. And if there's a desire to be part of the community, then the desire to do things to be cut off from the community diminish. And so we prioritize inclusion in the community, the assembly, over our desire to sin. Hence, the punishment is consistent, hopefully, to be able to encourage fidelity to the commandments as they're given, rather than having to resort to these kinds of things. Now, does it happen? Yes, it does. Did it happen in Israel? Certainly it did. But those individuals were to not be part of the assembly. An Ammonite or a Moabite was excluded until the 10th generation. Now, why is this the case?
To get them many years away from their original heritage.
Okay, so maybe the span, the generational span between them and their ancestors. Why are these two singled out? Now remember, what's that?
Verse 4 talks about how they didn't help them when they were coming out of Egypt.
That's exactly right. So there was hostility always between Ammon and Israel and between Moab and Israel. Why else? What else happened with Moab? Big event in Numbers. Anybody remember Balaam? Yeah, so what was he wanting to do?
Curse Israel.
On whose behalf? He wanted to curse Israel on whose behalf? Balak, king of Moab. And so when he went and offered sacrifice on 3 mountaintops, 3 different mountaintops, what could he only offer? Blessing. And so what did he tell Balak, king of Moab? At least per the Revelation letter, what does it tell us that Balak learned from Balaam?
He sent in his women to intermarry.
There you go. Intermarriage among the people will bring about the demise of God's people. And so again, he found the Achilles heel, at least in some respects, of Israel in their disobedience. And so what happens? Well, there's hostility between Moab and Ammon ever since. Okay, and so here's one of the results of that hostility. An Ammonite or a Moabite was excluded until the 10th generation. Edomites and Egyptians after the 3rd generation could enter the assembly. Why is that the case? Well, who's Edom?
Edomites are the descendants of Esau,
Mhm.
so they're part of the nation from Abraham. They're
So they have familial ties in Abraham. Yeah, they're a brother nation.
And the relationship that Jacob and Esau had, where Esau had threatened killing them, but then when he came back, they accepted one another, basically.
So there was resolution and a closure there between Jacob and Esau, certainly. So that has and does play a part. They are a brother nation, so 3 generations for Edom is sufficient for them to come into and be added to the assembly. Now, who is one of the most famous Edomites that we know of? Starts with a king, ends with a Herod. Do y'all know? King Herod was an Edomite. He was not a Jew. And so to think that King Herod was in any way Jewish is false. He was an Edomite. And so he was allowed after the 3rd generation to be part of the assembly. That we know that didn't always go so well. Now, Egyptians after the 3rd generation could enter the assembly as well. It seems to be a bit odd, but they didn't have the same kind of hostility that Ammon and Moab did against Israel. Okay, so again, there we see a difference. So these are the 4 that do not have admission to the assembly. They're excluded from the assembly of the Lord's people. All right, and so Moses talks about that. Then uncleanness in the camp. Why is it important to maintain purity and cleanness in the camp? Joash. Yes, if you do not have cleanliness, it breeds disease. One of the things that we had to do when I was in the military, especially when we bivouacked and did different things like that out in the field, was make sure that everything was hygienically sound. All right, so there are reasons why these laws are put in place, and reasons, even scientifically, why these things are put into place, and that's because God expected cleanness, purity. Is disease and illness part of purity? No, I mean, it's not. I mean, you can't be pure and be diseased and ill, right? So maybe I asked the question wrong or phrased it wrong, but purity demands healthiness, all right? So again, there is this desire on God's part to make sure that his people are maintaining cleanliness in the camp. Now, this refers specifically to military campaigns. So cleanliness in the camp was to be maintained during military campaigns. Part of that was using the restroom outside of the camp if you were a bedwetter, it made the person unclean, and they were to remain outside the camp until sunset. They had to wash and purify and make sure that they didn't bring disease into the camp because of it. All right, now this is Moses talking here, so I'm going to make sure we know that this is Bible. But Moses is talking about cleanliness among the people. There needs to be a sense in which they are taking care of those things properly. This is, by the way, not the same language that's used in Leviticus 15:16. This is referring to military encampments and things like that. The men of the camp were to use the restroom outside the camp for both hygienic and religious purposes. Hygienic purposes, it takes everything away from where the bulk of the people are. Religious purposes, what's the religious element of this? What do you have to be in order to worship God? Clean, right? So if you're defiled by these things, then you're not technically clean. All right, you have to be purified. So these things are done to maintain the cleanliness, both ritually and properly, of God's people. So Moses addresses it all. There are miscellaneous laws that we see in chapter 23, verses 15 through 18, and so it contains laws relating to escaped slaves and prostitution. A foreign escaped slave was to be offered sanctuary on Israelite territory. He was not to be oppressed. Why is that? Wouldn't we want to return him to his owner? Any famous escaped slaves that you know of in the Bible? Okay, they're like the they're the most famous escaped slaves, plural. That is the main reason, by the way, why they're to remain free in the land. Secondly, do we know of any other escaped slaves? Onesimus, yeah, Onesimus, right? Onesimus is an escaped slave. And what does Paul tell him? Go back. Yeah, absolutely. So to reconcile, okay, perhaps he's come to me at this point to return unto you, as he's writing to Philemon, as a brother. Yes, sir.
So it depends on the type of slavery.
Yes, that's the other point too. It also depends on the type of slavery. Was Onesimus a proper slave in that particular time? Slaves during that time did not have it that bad, in the sense that they were oppressed and afflicted constantly. They could actually carry on the master's affairs, run the household, take care of the children, do a lot of things. They lived in the house much more, in some senses, as a servant, as a helper, rather than a browbeat slave. Okay, so again, that might have some bearing on this, but the main key that we need to focus on is that Israelites were slaves to Egypt and fled to Israel. And so now when other individuals flee to Israel, they're not to be oppressed by God's people, to repeat the behavior that the Egyptians incurred on them. Okay? So no Israelite man or woman was to become a temple prostitute. That goes without saying, okay? Because this violates so many different things, doesn't it? It violates the purity expectations. It violates the faithfulness to God expectations. It violates the marriage principles. It violates the adultery principles. Okay, everything. So this is like, you do not do this. Okay, you do not become this. There's no money earned by prostitution, or no money earned, by prostitution was to be used to pay religious obligations at the house of the Lord. Why is that? It's dirty money, Joash says. Yeah, it's gotten from, or what we would call, ill-gotten gain. What did, in the New Testament, there's a discussion on money. Anybody remember what that discussion is by the Sanhedrin?
Oh, we're talking about the 30 pieces of silver that Judas Iscariot brought back in and threw into the temple.
Yes, so Judas Iscariot returned the money that he was paid to betray Christ. And what did they say? Well, we can't add it back to the temple treasury. Why? Because it's blood money. Okay, so the money itself that was returned to them, there was an element of uncleanness, impurity. to that sum. And so that had to be used or dispensed with in another way, in another vein. It could not go back to the temple treasury. Same principle is applied, by the way. So money, ill-gotten gain, cannot be given to God in this way. Unlawful deprivation. What does that mean? Simple terms, maybe one word. What does it mean to unlawfully deprive someone of something? To steal it, yes. So we're talking about theft here. We used to say in the military, tactically acquire. I know one thing that I heard all the time was there are no thieves in the Marine Corps. Everyone else is trying to get their stuff back, right? But that's true. I have a really funny story. I won't tell it now. I'll tell it later maybe. I would love to tell it now, but it does have to do with it, but I'll move on. This section deals with a further development of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. So again, we're looking at Moses going through the 10 commandments, not line by line per se, but proper application thereof. So stealing is always wrong, right? You're defrauding someone else of their personal property, okay? And that's a no-no. So the first 3 paragraphs deal with the theft of property, and the last 4 with the theft of life. Now, what is theft of life?
When I was studying this, I just kept thinking the same thing. Why does he have to go through in painful detail all of these things that we can or can't do based on the principle that you're going through? Hey, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't do all these things. It's because we're stupid.
So Joash makes a very pertinent point. He says, why does he have to go through all of these things line by line and flesh them out? He says partly because we're ignorant or stupid and can't understand some of these principles. And maybe because sometimes they're nuanced. How many of y'all have gotten into discussions of hypotheticals with people? Oh, well, what if this? Or what if that? Well, there's an underlying principle that is foundational to every hypothetical, right? And the problem is we want to get out of that underlying principle by caveats. Well, what if this is the case then? Or what if this is the case? And so if that's the mentality, we're going to find a way to justify or rationalize any one of these commands. So what is Moses seeking to undo? Undo any ability for individuals to go back and justify their position by rationalizing out a command. So you're absolutely right. He wanted to make sure a proper application of these things was being done. So the first 3 paragraphs deal with theft of property, the last 4 with theft of life. A fellow Israelite could not be charged interest on a loan. This did not apply to foreigners. What is the purpose of charging interest on a loan? Why do you do that? Profit, gain. So what is the principle involved here? Did you loan him the interest? No. So why are you getting it back? Did they have inflation like we have inflation? No. So it ain't accruing the initial cost, right? So why is that problematic? Because you're unfairly profiting off of a fellow Israelite. You're taking advantage of their situation in order to make money, okay? And so again, that's looked upon as theft, okay? Now, it didn't apply to foreigners. Why? Because they're foreigners. They're not part of the nation, all right? And so there's not an injunction against that. Now, this would lead later on to views that were inconsistent with what God expected their view for all mankind to be. Their thought was, if we can take advantage of them, then they're not as important as we are, and therefore it puffed them up a little bit more. But again, this charge does not apply to foreigners. Vows to the Lord were to be promptly paid. It was better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Failure to pay a vow constituted sin. So think about that. If you vowed a vow to the Lord, what did God expect from you? Yeah, to pay that vow. So how important is a vow to the Lord? It's binding. And if you don't fulfill it, then it would constitute sin. So what and how do you atone for sin? sacrifice. Okay, so again, if you vow a vow and don't pay it, it will cost you. That's the point. So if you're vowing a vow to God, what did Hannah vow? Anybody remember Hannah?
She vowed to give her, if God would give her a son, she would turn him over to the Lord. And
Yep.
That's where Samuel comes in.
And so what did God do? God blessed her with Samuel. And did she fulfill her vow? Yes, she did. Now there's a vow that most of us make. What is that vow? Marriage. Does God expect us to fulfill that vow? Yes, He does. Okay? And it's made before God and men. It's made before everybody when you and I make that vow. All right? So again, there is an expectation by God to fulfill that vow. And if that vow is not honored, then it does constitute sin.
Chance,
Yes, sir.
one of the things that I've always been a heartburn on mine is a lot of people, when they think about a vow and we talk about paying it,
Mhm.
they always think about it, it's a monetary thing. If God blesses me, I'm going to give this much more, or I'm going to give this to the Lord. I like the part here says, with our mouth, making the vow, we have to realize when we became a Christian, we made a vow to God that if He removes our sins and we surrender them to Him, then He will give us salvation. And that's important that we understand that a vow is not just a promise for money, it's a promise for our life or material or whatever.
Well, it's a promise to God that you're going to behave in a certain way, right?
Yes.
So, does God help us fulfill our vows to Him? What do you think? I hear yeses. How? How does God help us fulfill our vows? Anybody ever made a vow to the Lord? I have. Guess what? God definitely helps you fulfill that vow. In fact, He might even close doors that would keep you from fulfilling that vow. I know from personal experience. All right, so again, God will help us fulfill that vow if it is a vow that is intended to, on our part, to be kept. I'm not saying, utter rash words to God. I know the Ecclesiastes writer tells us just as much. Okay? Let not thy mouth be hasty to utter anything before the Lord, because God is in heaven and thou upon the earth. Therefore let thy words be few. But when you and I make a vow to the Lord, there is an expectation that it is fulfilled. Now, will God hold us to vows that are unscriptural, that are immoral? No. Why? Because we ought not be making those vows in the first place, right? But the vows that are moral, that are right, and that promote a proper disposition toward God, certainly they were beholden to fulfill. Okay? Does that mean now that God doesn't do that anymore and we can't ever make any vows to God, or if we do? I'm not going to jump into all of those things. I know that the Lord talks about some of those things in Matthew chapter 6, or chapter 7 rather, but we'll move on for the sake of brevity. Now, again, one passing through a vineyard or grain field could not partake of his neighbor's grapes or grain. Or could, partake of his neighbor's grapes or grain. This did not constitute theft. He could not attempt to harvest or carry off his produce. What's the difference?
One's for nourishment and one's for profit.
Yeah, one's for nourishment. One could, ostensibly be for profit. Or if I go over to my neighbor's, field and grab this group of, or this cluster of vines, or this section of wheat, I can take that and I won't have to use my own for a while, and I'll be taken care of. Now that is theft. Where does this happen, by the way, in the New Testament?
It happens with Jesus and the apostles, where they're going through the grain field, and the apostles pull some of the grain and shuck it in their hands to eat as they're passing through.
Yes, so in the New Testament, Jesus is accused of what? Not stealing, but working on the Sabbath, violating the Sabbath, because as he walked through the grain field, him and his disciples grabbed probably the heads of wheat and ate them as they were walking along. Is this consistent with what the law allows? Yes, it is. Okay, is it inconsistent with harvesting? Do y'all know the difference between harvesting and grabbing a few stalks? Yeah, I think we do. Okay, But they had taken some of these things to the ridiculous extreme and said, well, on the Sabbath, you can't do this because that's harvesting. Well, no, that's not harvesting. All right. And this is the precedent for that law. Now, it wasn't theft. It was the ability for the Israelites to be maintained as they were traveling or going through or that kind of stuff. Again, not stopping and cutting down a whole section of somebody's field and hauling it off. You couldn't do that. And then a woman once divorced and married by another could never return to the first husband under any circumstances. Wait a minute. If they want to reconcile after the second divorce, this other person can't reconcile? Why not? What's that? It would be considered adultery, Diane says. It's mixing unions, right, that ought not be mixed. If that first union was dissolved, then it's dissolved. She's gone on and married another and has been with that other person. Now to go back to this other individual that put you away was against what God expected for them in their conduct. Again, it was a mixture that should not happen. So
It's also, it's whether the second husband dies also. If the second husband dies and the marriage is ended in that way, she still could not go back and remarry the first husband.
what's that? Once she married somebody else, that sealed the deal.
It sealed the deal.
Yeah, there was no going back to that first husband, ever, if she married.
You're right, but if the guy, okay, I hate to get,
Here we go.
if he died, the second husband died, and the first husband was free and wanted her back, then yeah, no?
No. Once she entered into that covenant with that next husband, that completely excluded him from viability anymore.
Maybe it's just a modern take.
It is a modern change. I mean, again, that is a modern thing that we've impressed upon people. Oh, well, it's fine, or this or that. I have my own thoughts, I think, biblically substantiated on a lot of that too. But right now, for our case and for our sakes right here, God wanted purity in the marriage relationships. You don't want to confuse the lineages and the lines, right? So it's a matter of inheritances and property and how those are divided up. Okay, it's going to be very important. So say she marries this second guy and has a child with him, and now that child is the heir of this particular line, and then she goes back over to this other person that she was already married to and has children with him. Now, where do the inheritances fall? Are they family? Are they related? Do those lands come together? Right? So it builds problems into the inheritances that don't need to be there. All right? So there's practical reasons why this is the case, also moral why this is the case. A new wife was entitled to the companionship of her husband for at least 1 year. The husband could not be drafted for military service. Okay, so there's a blessing there. If people are at war, guy gets married, he stays home for a year. Why? Well, to build that relationship with his spouse. Okay, he can't be drafted into service, which that would be a nice law if we had it in our land, but we don't. But there's reasons for that. Also, a millstone could not be taken as security for a debt. That which a man earned his livelihood could not be used for collateral or for this purpose. Why is that? Yeah, how would he ever pay it back? And how would he take care of himself in the meantime, right? I mean, that might almost be akin, I know it's not, but it might almost be akin to someone taking your car as collateral for a debt, and now you don't have any way to get to a job to work in order to pay off that debt. Do you see the problem there? Yeah, but then in this instance, you're also robbing them of the sustenance that they need, because a millstone was important for farming, for agriculture, all right? You needed it to press your wheat and to refine it, all right? So it was very important. So any of those kinds of things could not be taken as collateral. Kidnapping resulted in involuntary servitude, or resulting rather in involuntary servitude, was punishable by death. So is kidnapping for the purpose of slavery acceptable? No. How did people become servants? Willingly, indentured servitude, most of the time to pay off a debt or to resolve a debt, or they bound themselves to that individual. I know that when Joshua goes into the land, they make a deal with a town that they're going to be servants for the Israelites and will take care of them. But then they voluntarily entered into that contract. So when Paul talks about man stealing in Timothy and talks about those individuals not being or inheriting the kingdom of heaven, what is a man stealer? Well, it is this person. Those who go and forcibly round up individuals and commit them to harsh slavery. And so this is condemned by God's people, or by God for God's people. Fairness principle. Who likes things to be fair? Anybody? We all do, yeah. So God set up rules for his people in order to show that there needs to be an element of fairness in their dealings with one another. So this is chapter 24:8 through 25, verse 4. And so this is an elaboration of the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. Is it fair to lie about someone else? No. We want what kind of trial in the United States, we always say? A what? Fair and on a speedy trial, right? I think that's typically what they say. We want a fair and speedy trial. We have a right to a fair and speedy trial, something that is taken care of that doesn't take up all of our time. Unfortunately, that's not the way the dockets work today. But the idea is the same. You are entitled to fairness when it comes to matters of law, and someone perjuring themselves against you is not fair. Remember, what was the punishment for someone who bore false witness against another individual? Was it death? That's exactly right. They got the same punishment they were trying to inflict on the other person. If it was capital punishment, then certainly capital punishment would be rendered. Why? Because they were trying to get them to be put to death. But if it were defrauding them through law by any other means, then they would have to pay restitution. They would have to pay that amount. Okay? So a person with leprous skin disease should not be allowed to jeopardize the well-being of the community. The sanitation laws were to be strictly followed. So what's the fairness principle here? Why were they excluded? Why were they set out from cleanliness? What's the false witness element here? How much of your body do robes cover? Anybody know? Pretty much everything except your face and maybe your feet. Could you hide skin diseases underneath your clothing? Yes. So again, the principle is seen in not defrauding the assembly because of your desire to be part of the group. Okay, so when we talk about the leprous individual, skin diseases should not be allowed to jeopardize the well-being of the community. What happens when the whole community becomes unclean? What's that? Yeah, they're all unacceptable, and now they have to go through an entire national religious ceremony in order to purify the nation again. So is this time-consuming? Yes. Is it frustrating? Yes. Is it, here's the word, fair? It's not fair to the rest of the people to have to do all that on account of one person who decided that they were going to misrepresent themselves and so go into the assembly. So again, that's the principle there. A lender was not to enter the home of a borrower to secure collateral. What does that mean? I can't go break down your door and take your stuff and say you can get it back when you pay me your debt. That'd be akin to stealing. What does the law say? The person offered up collateral, right? They would offer collateral to the creditor and say, we'll give you this and we'll pay off, whatever debt we are, and when we do, we get that back. Okay, what could not be offered? Millstone, yeah. Just want to see if y'all were paying attention 5 minutes ago. So that's exactly right. So the creditor was also protected from covetousness. That's very important. What if this guy has a really big debt, but he has a really nice, shiny new object? And so the creditor goes into his house and sees these nice, shiny things and says, ooh, I want those, and takes them himself as collateral, knowing that the debt will never be paid. well, then he's just enriched himself, hasn't he? He's been covetous and taken those things from a fellow Israelite. So again, they couldn't go into one another's homes and steal those things as collateral. They were not justified in so doing. The collateral of a poor man, most likely his cloak, was to be returned to him at sunset. Why is that? Yeah, key part, poor man, that's all he's got. And so you take it every day as collateral, and then you give it back to him at night so he can utilize it. So what's the point of taking it during the day? Is there?
It says a principle that he owes money. He needs to know that he owes money.
Yes.
But at the same time, the person that's taking the money, taking it, I mean,
That's exactly right. Joash is right. It sets the principle that this man owes money, right? So every time he has to turn that cloak over, it's an acknowledgement of the debt that he owes this individual. Now, being a poor man, he gets it back. But as someone who has credited this man things, what would be the natural tendency? Would you want to take his cloak every single day? What would tend to happen, do you think? Yeah, forgive the debt. That's also an option, by the way, for the Israelites when it comes to whether or not they hold someone to a debt. A hired man was to be paid daily. If an employer withheld pay, he was guilty of sin. Now, when Jesus tells his parable of the laborers in the vineyard, this is exactly what we have, okay? In Matthew, as Jesus is talking about this, he goes out to the market about the first hour and calls men to work in his vineyard, and they strike a deal with him and say, you know, a penny a day. And he says, okay. And then he goes out the third, the sixth, the ninth, and the 11th hour and says, whatsoever is right, I will give you. Okay, then we have the paying. The paying is exactly what we see in the old law. Okay, they stand in line and wait for the master to distribute the funds to the individual who worked in his vineyard that day. Why was that necessary? Jesus, in his model prayer, makes a comment about daily things, and what does he say? Give us this day our daily bread, right? This is the idea that there's a trust and confidence in God that he will provide for them daily, all right? What does Jesus say about looking towards the future? Give no thought for tomorrow, right? What's that? I'll take care of you. Tomorrow will provide for the things of itself. Okay, absolutely. So, again, God is taking care of them daily, and God has enshrined in the law ways not to defraud those individuals who are working for hire. All right, so again, if they didn't pay them, they were guilty of sin. So they must guard against overzealousness in the punishment of crime. Anybody get excited about punishment? Inflicting punishment on others? There are some that do. Where would the danger fall? Does sin always bring about good feelings? No. When you're the recipient of someone's misconduct, how do you feel? Angry, right? So what is written in the law for their protection? Not to let their anger get the best of them in inflicting the punishment, okay? And just losing all sense of sanity and overly punishing them. So only the guilty were to be punished. Now, we saw this with King Amaziah. Amaziah showed restraint in what way? Do y'all remember that lesson? It was several weeks back, so I know you've slept since then. But what did Amaziah do? What happened to Amaziah's dad? Let's start there. Amaziah's dad was murdered by folks. And so when Amaziah assumed the kingship in Judah, what did he do? He killed them back. Yeah, but who did he not kill? The children, the families. Again, so there's a danger in going so far as to punish the whole family for the wrong of one group. Now, God authorizes this in certain situations, doesn't he? One situation that is very important that they'll be faced with shortly, okay, within probably about a month and a half. Joshua and his compatriots, after hearing this from Moses, will be faced with it. But God intervenes to say that this is what he expects. And that is the story of Achan and Ai, right? What did Achan do? He disobeyed God. He took of the holy things of Jericho, okay? And they were not supposed to have taken from them. The whole family, in essence, hid it from the rest of the folks. We'll pick up here in the fairness principle next week and hopefully get through chapter 28. I appreciate your attention this morning.